The fluorescent lights in the emergency room buzzed faintly, casting a cold, almost unforgiving glow over the chaos of midnight. Nurses rushed past with carts of sterile instruments, the squeak of rubber saws cutting through the low murmur of panicked voices. And in the middle of it all, sprawled across a gurney, was a man whose face was twisted in agony. His hands clutched desperately at the sheets, knuckles white, sweat pouring down his temples. His cries were not the kind anyone forgets. Hoarse, guttural, almost animal. He wasn't bleeding from a car accident. He hadn't been shot or stabbed. What was killing him was something far more private, far more humiliating. The doctors leaned over his body, their expressions grave. They whispered to each other in clipped tones, trying to stay calm while moving fast. The smell around him was impossible to ignore, an acrid, rotting stench that made even seasoned nurses wince. "We're out of time," one of the surgeons muttered, as another shook his head, already preparing for what had to be done. They weren't trying to save a limb. They weren't even trying to stop internal bleeding. No, this man's infection was so severe, so advanced, that the only way to keep him alive was to remove the very thing that defined him in his own mind as a man. His wife stood just beyond the curtain, trembling. She had brought him here after days of insisting something was wrong. For weeks she'd smelled it, something sour and foul seeping from their bedroom. A smell he kept brushing off with excuses. Laundry, old food, don't worry about it, he had told her. But the truth had been festering in silence, growing worse with every hour he refused to face it. Now the secret was laid bare, and the price was unthinkable. The doctors didn't mince words. They explained the situation in blunt clinical terms. If they didn't act now, the infection would spread to his bloodstream, shutting down his organs one by one. He'd be dead within hours. The only option left was surgery, immediate and irreversible. He would live, but his manhood would not. He tried to protest, tried to bargain. Through clenched teeth and gasps of pain, he begged them to find another way, any other way. But medicine doesn't bend to pride. His wife, tears streaking her face, signed the consent forms with a shaking hand. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about betrayal or lies or how he had gotten here. She was just thinking about survival. Later, there would be time for anger. Later, there would be time for truth. As the surgical team rolled him toward the operating room, his mind spun backward. He had thought this was just a fling, just an affair. Something to light a spark in a life that had grown predictable, maybe even dull. It was supposed to be secret, thrilling, disposable. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. But now, every step of the gurney's wheels was a reminder that choices have consequences, and some consequences can't ever be undone. Inside the sterile white walls of that hospital, a man's double life came crashing down. The affair he thought he could keep hidden had already destroyed his health. Soon, it would destroy much more. By sunrise, he would awaken to a reality so brutal he could barely comprehend it. He would awaken less than he had been before, with shame where desire once lived and rage where love had turned sour. And that rage would not fade quietly. It would fester, grow, and eventually explode into violence. The nurses didn't know that. The doctors didn't know that. To them, he was just another critical case, another body to stabilize. But behind his gasps and groans, something darker was already taking root. Because when you strip away a man's pride, his secrets, and finally his very sense of self, what's left is not always gratitude for survival. Sometimes what's left is fury, and that fury was about to set him on a path that no surgeon's knife could ever fix. That night in the ER wasn't just a medical emergency. It was the first domino, the moment when a simple affair transformed into something monstrous. He thought he could cheat in the shadows and walk away unscathed. He thought nobody would ever know. But now the whole world was going to know, because what started in a motel room was about to end in blood. He met her in the most ordinary way, or at least that's how it started. A Friday night, the kind where he told his wife he'd be working late. In truth, he had no deadlines pressing, no projects waiting on his desk. What he had was restlessness. Years of marriage had dulled into routine, and he craved something, anything, that made him feel alive again. She was the spark, younger, vibrant, with a voice that curled around his ears like smoke. They met at a bar not far from the highway, where dim lights and cheap whiskey made it easy to forget the promises he had once made. It began with drinks, with laughter that came too easily. One thing led to another, and soon they were stealing away to motels on the edge of town, the kind that rented by the hour, with neon signs flickering vacancy into the night. The secrecy electrified him. Every kiss, every hurried encounter felt like a rebirth. He told himself it was harmless, just an escape. Nobody needed to know. Nobody would get hurt. But affairs have a way of demanding more. Soon, their trysts were no longer occasional. He was inventing excuses, lying to colleagues, ignoring family dinners. She made him feel wanted in a way he hadn't felt in years. But beneath the thrill, something sinister had already taken hold. One night, after one of their motel rendezvous, he woke with a raw ache between his legs. At first he dismissed it. Maybe too much roughness, maybe a small infection, nothing worth panicking over. But within days, the irritation grew unbearable. A burning sensation that made him flinch with every step. Then came the discharge, the swelling, and worst of all, the smell. Sharp, putrid, the kind of odor that lingered in the sheets and clung to his skin. He scrubbed furiously in the shower, dousing himself in soap and cologne, but nothing masked it for long. At home, his wife noticed. She wrinkled her nose when she walked past their bedroom. She asked if he'd forgotten to take out the trash if a rat had died in the walls. He laughed it off, avoided her gaze, and tried to change the subject. But deep down, panic churned. He knew what this was, or at least he thought he did. A sexually transmitted infection, the kind people whispered about but never admitted. The thought of seeing a doctor terrified him. To admit the problem was to admit the affair, and that was unthinkable. So he tried to handle it himself. He searched online, ordered over-the-counter creams, even swallowed antibiotics left over from an old prescription. But nothing helped. In fact, things got worse. The pain sharpened until every movement was agony. The swelling grew grotesque, his skin darkening in patches that looked almost dead. Still, he refused to go to the hospital. He shut himself in the bedroom, claiming exhaustion, flu, migraines, anything to avoid his wife's suspicions. But she wasn't blind. She heard his groans at night, smelled the sour rot that clung to his sheets, watched the way he walked gingerly, as though even standing upright was too much. When she pressed him, he snapped. "It's nothing. Leave it alone." But her unease only deepened. One evening, she finally pushed back the blanket while he slept. What she saw made her recoil in horror. The flesh was discolored, swollen, leaking pus. It looked less like a body part than something decaying. Her scream jolted him awake. In that instant, the charade was over. He couldn't hide anymore. Her face twisted in disgust, in shock. She demanded answers. How could this happen? What had he done? He stammered excuses, half-truths, denials. But the evidence lay rotting before them. And now, the infection had spread too far. She dragged him to the emergency room, furious and terrified. Doctors swarmed, and their verdict was swift necrosis. The tissue was dying, poisoned by bacteria that thrive in the shadows of his secrecy. The infection was racing toward his bloodstream. If they didn't act, it would kill him. The word amputation hung in the air like a death sentence. He begged for alternatives, pleaded for more time, but there was none. His wife, through tears of rage and betrayal, signed the papers. The man who had thought he could juggle a double life, who thought he could keep a secret mistress tucked away in the shadows, was about to pay a price he could never reverse. Hours later, he woke from surgery to a silence heavier than any he'd ever known. His wife stood at the foot of the bed, her eyes hard and cold. No words passed between them, but he could feel the canyon that had opened, the unbridgeable distance carved by deceit and disease. And beneath his shame, something else was building. A dark ember of fury, glowing hotter with every passing moment. He told himself she was the one who ruined him, the younger woman who had. He convinced himself he had been tricked, used, left to rot. And as that anger took root, he stopped seeing himself as the guilty one. He saw himself as the victim. The doctors had saved his life, but they had also lit a fuse. A man stripped of pride, stripped of dignity, now had only one thing left to cling to: vengeance. When he opened his eyes the next morning, the room was too quiet. The hospital hum had faded into a silence that pressed down on him, heavier than the weight of any bandage. He didn't have to look under the sheets to know what was missing. The dull ache in his lower body told him everything. He reached down anyway, fingers trembling, and when he felt only smooth layers of gauze where his manhood had once been, a raw cry tore out of him. It wasn't just pain, it was grief, disbelief, and fury tangled into one unbearable sound. His wife stood at the far corner of the room, arms crossed, her face a mask carved out of stone. She didn't rush to his side, didn't whisper reassurances. She just watched, and in her eyes, he could see something worse than anger, contempt. She had begged him for honesty, begged him to see a doctor weeks ago. Instead, he had lied, had risked his own life, and dragged her into this nightmare. Now she couldn't look at him without remembering what his betrayal had cost. The days that followed were a blur of antiseptic smells, morphine drips, and whispered conversations outside his door. Nurses tried to be kind, but their pitying glances stung. He overheard their hushed tones, words like necrosis, STD, self-inflicted. Every chart that passed from hand to hand was another record of his humiliation. He wasn't just a patient, he was a cautionary tale. When he was finally discharged, the humiliation only deepened. At home, his wife treated him less like a partner and more like a stranger camped in her guest room. She cooked for the children, kept the house running, but barely spoke to him beyond necessity. At night, the bed they once shared stayed cold, an invisible wall dividing them. He tried to reach for her once, desperate for some shred of closeness, but she recoiled as if his touch burned. "Don't," she snapped, her voice sharp with disgust. Word began to spread. At first, he thought it was paranoia, the sidelong glances at the grocery store, the way conversations died when he walked into a room. But then he overheard two neighbors on the porch, their voices low, but not low enough. "You know what happened, right?" They had to cut it off. The words hit him like a slap. His private shame had become public gossip. Soon it was everywhere, in the snickers at work, in the curious looks from old friends, in the whispered questions that followed his children at school. He stopped leaving the house. He stopped looking in the mirror. Every reflection was a reminder of what he had lost, of what he could never get back. The man who once walked tall, who prided himself on being in control, now shuffled through hallways like a ghost. He drank heavily, trying to drown the gnawing emptiness. But the liquor only sharpened the voice in his head, the one that whispered it wasn't his fault. His marriage crumbled piece by piece. His wife filed for separation papers within weeks, citing irreconcilable differences. To her, The affair had been the final straw. The surgery, just the rotten fruit of years of lies. She didn't scream, didn't throw things, didn't cry. She was simply done. And that calmness cut deeper than any outburst could have. The children were quieter around him, too. His teenage son avoided eye contact, embarrassed by the whispers he heard at school. His daughter, too young to fully understand, asked why Mommy never hugged Daddy anymore. He had no answers, only silence. The shame curdled into rage. He replayed every detail of the affair in his mind, but never once did he blame himself. In his twisted reasoning, it wasn't the lies or the recklessness that had ruined him. It was her, the younger woman who had promised him passion, who had coaxed him into those motel rooms, who had left him with a rotting infection that stole everything from him. In his mind, she had ruined everything. At night, lying awake in the suffocating quiet of his half-empty home, he fantasized about confronting her. He imagined her shocked face, her apologies, her begging for forgiveness. But the fantasies always ended the same way. Not with forgiveness, but with retribution. The more he thought about it, the more the idea took root, feeding on the wreckage of his pride. Every reminder of his humiliation pushed him closer. The sound of his wife's heels as she left for work without saying goodbye. The laughter of neighbors drifting through open windows. The sting of seeing his once-close friends cross the street to avoid him. Each cut left him rawer, angrier, more convinced that someone had to pay. And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly, shame gave way to obsession. He stopped seeing her, the mistress, as a person at all. She became the embodiment of his suffering, a symbol of everything he had lost. In his mind, she wasn't just guilty of betrayal. She was guilty of mutilating him, of branding him with a scar that the world would never let him forget. He started a plan, not openly, not with pen and paper, but in the restless churn of his mind. He knew where she lived. He knew her routines. He knew that one day, when the anger became too much to contain, he would show up at her door. And when that day came, it wouldn't be for answers. It wouldn't be for closure. It would be for vengeance. He waited until the middle of the week, when he knew her new boyfriend would be on a late shift and she would be home alone. By then, the plan had been rehearsed 100 times in his mind. He parked his car 2 blocks away, the night air thick with the hum of cicadas and the faint smell of gasoline from a nearby station. His hands trembled as he pulled on a pair of thin leather gloves, slick from sweat. The cheap knife he'd bought sat heavy in his jacket pocket. He told himself this wasn't premeditation, just a confrontation. He just wanted her to see what she'd done, to admit her role in his ruin. But deep down, he knew better. He hadn't come all this way for words. Her apartment complex was quiet, the flickering security light doing little to break the shadows. He knew the way. He had been here before, back when their meetings were filled with stolen kisses and whispered promises. Now, every step toward her door felt like a march into something darker. When she opened the door, surprise flashed across her face. She wasn't expecting him, not anymore. Her smile froze, then fell away entirely when she saw the look in his eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice wary. He pushed past her without answering, the stale air of her living room closing in around him. The walls were decorated with cheap art, the faint smell of perfume lingering in the cushions. Once, this place had been their secret refuge. Now it felt like a cage. "You ruined me," he spat, his voice low and shaking. "Do you even know what they did to me? Do you know what I've lost?" She backed away, her hands raised as if to keep him at bay. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me." His voice cracked into a roar. "You gave me this. You gave me death. They cut it off because of you." Her eyes widened in horror, but then something shifted. A smirk flickered across her lips, half disbelief, half disdain. You think that's my fault? You think I was the only one you were with? You're pathetic. The word struck like a match against gasoline. Pathetic. The shame he'd carried for weeks ignited into white-hot rage. Before he even realized it, the knife was in his hand, gleaming under the dim light. She gasped, stumbling backward. Wait, don't. But there was no stopping now. He lunged, slashing wildly. She screamed, tried to fight back, her hands clawing at his face, her nails leaving burning trails on his skin. Furniture toppled, a lamp shattered. The room became a blur of violence and shadows. When it was over, the silence was suffocating. She lay sprawled across the carpet, her chest heaving shallowly before finally stilling. The floor beneath her bloomed red, seeping into the fibers, spreading wider with every second. His breath came in ragged gasps, the knife slipping from his bloody hand and clattering against the floor. He stared down at her, his mind reeling. He had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality was far uglier. There was no satisfaction, no closure, only emptiness. Panic surged. He couldn't just leave her like this. He wiped the knife clean on his sleeve, his gloves now sticky and slick. He stumbled around the apartment, grabbing pill bottles, scattering them on the floor near her body. He tugged a half-empty vodka bottle from the counter and tipped it over, letting the liquid pool beside her. In his frantic mind, it looked like suicide, a woman who had drunk too much, swallowed too many pills. Maybe, just maybe, they would believe it. But he had left too much behind. The neighbor's dog had barked when he came up the stairs. His fingerprints smeared across the doorknob despite the gloves. A camera across the street blinked silently, capturing the arrival of his car hours before, and the scratches across his cheek and neck, her desperate last defense, were deep, angry welts that no excuse could erase. He fled the apartment, stumbling into the night, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the world. As he walked back to his car, he tried to steady his breathing, tried to convince himself he had done what he had to do. She had destroyed him first. This was justice. But back home, the reality sank in. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The blood on his clothes wouldn't wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. The images wouldn't leave his mind, her face twisted in terror, the sound of her last breath. He poured whiskey down his throat, hoping to numb it, but the memories clung tighter. By morning, the news had already spread. Local woman found dead in her apartment, the headlines read. Police investigating suspicious circumstances. Photos of the complex filled the screen, yellow tape fluttering in the wind. Neighbors described hearing a struggle, a scream cut short. And then the police knocked at his door. He tried to play dumb, tried to feign shock. But detectives had already pieced together enough to know something didn't fit. Her phone held messages from him, heated words, and veiled threats. Security footage placed his car near her building at the time of the murder. The scratches across his face told a story he couldn't rewrite. They led him away in handcuffs as neighbors watched from their porches. Some shook their heads. Others whispered. His wife didn't even come to the door. She had already packed her things, already decided she wanted no part of the man he had become. Sitting in the back of the patrol car, he finally realized the truth. He had thought the surgery was the worst humiliation of his life. But this, being paraded through the flashing lights, reporters shouting questions, neighbors pointing and staring, this was worse. His shame had turned to rage, his rage to blood, and now blood had turned to chains. The affair was over. His life was over. And the path forward stretched only one way, into the cold, unrelenting walls of a prison cell. The crime scene was sealed off before sunrise. Yellow tape stretched across the apartment complex, fluttering in the morning breeze as neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering theories. Inside, the living room was chaos. Pill bottles scattered across the carpet, a vodka bottle tipped on its side, glass shards glinting from a broken lamp. And at the center of it all lay her body, sprawled in a pool of dried blood, eyes wide and vacant. Detective Renee Barlow had seen her share of stage scenes. 20 years in homicide gave her a sixth sense, a radar for when something wasn't right. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. Suicide scenes didn't look like this. Suicides didn't usually fight back. And this woman had fought hard. The scratches on her attacker's face weren't here, of course, but the torn fingernails, the blood under them, told the story clearly. Barlow crouched near the body, noting the angle of the wounds. "These aren't self-inflicted," she murmured. She didn't do this to herself. The medical examiner nodded grimly. A knife, multiple stab wounds, defensive cuts along her hands and arms. Whatever charade had been attempted here, it was sloppy. Outside, neighbors were eager to talk. One remembered hearing raised voices around midnight, followed by a scream that cut off suddenly. Another swore they saw a man leaving in a hurry, his face partially obscured, but his build familiar. And then there was the security camera across the street, which hadn't missed a thing. A sedan pulling up, a man stepping out, walking toward her apartment, and leaving again nearly an hour later. The license plate was blurry, but not unreadable. When the footage came back, the name on the registration made every piece click into place. It belonged to him, the man she'd once been seen with at motels, the man whose marriage was crumbling, the man who now carried a reputation no one dared say out loud, but everyone knew. Detective Barlow requested his hospital records. What she found was damning. A recent surgery for advanced necrosis. Notes from doctors detailing a severe, untreated infection. Confidential interviews suggested the infection was sexually transmitted. His wife, when brought in for questioning, did not hold back. Her bitterness poured out like acid. "He lied to me for months," she said, eyes cold and steady. "I begged him to see a doctor, but he wouldn't. He was seeing her. Everyone knew it. And then the infection. By the time he finally went, it was too late. They cut it off. Do you understand? My husband lost everything because of that woman. At least, that's how he sees it." Barlow pressed further. Had he ever mentioned her by name? Had he ever threatened her? The wife paused, lips tightening. "Not directly, but I could tell. The way he spoke, the way he stewed in silence. I knew he blamed her." Detectives pulled phone records next. The text messages were like a fuse burning toward an explosion. Weeks of angry messages, accusations, late-night calls. "You'll pay for this. You don't know what you've done to me." The last one, sent hours before her death, read simply, "We need to talk. Tonight." Meanwhile, forensic teams combed through the apartment. The knife hadn't been recovered, but a partial bloody footprint near the door matched his shoe size. And the blood under her fingernails, when tested, was not hers. It matched his DNA. When they brought him in for questioning, he tried to hold his composure. He slumped in the chair, arms folded, insisting he hadn't seen her in weeks. "I was home," he said flatly. "Ask my wife." But his wife had already dismantled that alibi. She told them he left the house that night, muttering something about settling things. Barlow leaned across the table, her voice calm but cutting. "We have your car on camera outside her apartment. We have your blood under her fingernails. We have your messages threatening her. You want to tell me again where you were?" His jaw tightened. For a moment, silence stretched so long the hum of the overhead light became deafening. Finally, he slammed his hand against the table. "She ruined me." The words echoed through the room. His chest heaved as his face flushed crimson. "She laughed at me. Do you know what that's like? To be less than a man? To be a joke. It wasn't a full confession, but it was close enough. The detectives exchanged a glance. They had him. Within days, the story hit the press. Local headlines exploded with lurid detail. Affair turns deadly. Man accused of murder after botched surgery. National outlets picked it up, splashing his mugshot across screens with sensational taglines. Talk shows debated his motives. Was he a monster driven by pride, or a broken man pushed past his limits? Social media tore him apart with hashtags like hashtag no excuse for murder and hashtag affair gone wrong. As the investigation deepened, more pieces fell into place. Colleagues admitted he'd been acting erratic at work. A neighbor remembered seeing him pacing in his yard late at night, muttering under his breath. His own son, reluctantly, told police about overhearing a drunken rant. If she thinks she can ruin me, she's dead wrong. Forensic pathologists finalized the autopsy report. Multiple stab wounds, none self-inflicted, signs of struggle. The toxicology screen showed alcohol in her system, but nowhere near enough for suicide. The pills scattered on the floor? Untouched. The scene had been a performance, staged badly by a man who thought his desperation could cover his tracks. Detective Barlow stood before the press after the indictment, her words steady, almost clinical. This was not an accident. This was not suicide. This was murder carried out in anger, and we have the evidence to prove it. Behind her, the victim's family clutched each other, their grief laid bare for the cameras. In the end, the case was airtight. From the blood under her nails to the text that read like a confession, the mountain of evidence loomed too high to climb. The man who had once thought he could cheat in secret, who thought his affair was just a fleeting thrill, now faced the harsh reality of life behind bars. And yet, even as he sat in his cell awaiting trial, he refused to see himself as guilty. In his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the wronged, the betrayed, the man stripped of everything. But to the detectives, the jury, and the world outside those prison walls, the truth was simpler. He wasn't a victim. He was a killer. The courthouse was packed on the first day of trial. Journalists lined the steps, microphones outstretched, while cameras flashed relentlessly. By now, his story had become national news. A man who lost his manhood after an affair, then allegedly killed the woman he blamed. The headline alone was enough to guarantee public fascination, and the courtroom gallery overflowed with curious spectators, true crime podcasters, and grieving family members. He entered in an orange jumpsuit, shackles clinking softly as deputies guided him to the defense table. His once proud shoulders sagged, his face hollowed by months in county lockup. Yet when he sat down, he tried to square his jaw, as though willing himself to look unbroken. Across the aisle sat the victim's family, eyes fixed on him with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The prosecution wasted no time. District Attorney Carlin Gwynn, sharp and relentless, painted the story in stark terms. This case is not about medical misfortune, she told the jury in her opening statement. This case is about a man consumed by pride and shame who chose to punish the woman he blamed for his own mistakes. He did not come to talk. He came with a knife, and he left her to die. She laid out the evidence, the threatening texts, the security footage, the blood under the victim's fingernails, the staged suicide attempt. Each piece stacked higher until the weight felt crushing. This was premeditated, and Gwynn concluded. Planned. Intentional. He wanted her silenced, and he made sure she would never speak again. His defense attorney, Samuel Harris, countered with a softer narrative. He didn't deny the affair. He didn't deny the surgery. What he argued was that this man had snapped. He was humiliated, broken, mocked for something no man should endure, Harris said, pacing before the jury. He did not set out that night to kill her. He sought closure, maybe even compassion. But in the heat of the moment, in the chaos of anger and despair, he lost control. The defense asked for a lesser charge, manslaughter, not murder. The trial unfolded like theater. Witness after witness took the stand. A neighbor described hearing the scream that pierced the night. A forensic expert testified about the pattern of stab wounds, demonstrating to the jury how they could not have been self-inflicted. The medical examiner detailed the ferocity of the attack, his voice measured but grim. Then came the wife, dressed in a dark blazer, her testimony cut like glass. She recounted the infection, the smell in their bedroom, the hospital's grim decision. Her voice trembled only once, when she described signing the consent forms that sealed her husband's fate. "He never forgave me for that," she admitted. But more than that, he never forgave her. Under cross-examination, the defense tried to frame her as bitter, motivated by her own betrayal. But the jury could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the years of lies that had hollowed her out. Her credibility held. Finally, the jury heard from Detective Renee Barlow. Calm and precise, she walked them through the evidence like a puzzle snapping into place. The messages, the security footage, the DNA. "It all points to one conclusion," she said firmly. "He was there. He fought with her. And he killed her." When the defendant himself took the stand, it was a gamble. His attorney hoped the jury might sympathize if they heard his shame in his own words. He spoke haltingly at first, describing the infection, the surgery, the humiliation. "I wasn't myself anymore," he said, voice cracking. "She laughed at me. She ruined me. I just wanted her to understand what she'd done." But under cross-examination, District Attorney Nguyen pressed him harder. "You wanted her to understand? Is that why you brought a knife?" He stammered. "You wanted her silenced? Is that why you staged the scene with pills and vodka?" His silence spoke louder than any words could. Closing arguments sealed his fate. Nguyen told the jury, "Shame is not an excuse for murder. Betrayal is not a license to kill. He chose violence, and now he must face the consequences." Harris pleaded for mercy, painting him as a broken man who lost everything, a man whose crime was born of weakness, not malice. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the air in the courtroom turned heavy, each breath thick with anticipation. The foreperson rose, voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The victim's family wept openly, clutching each other's hands. His wife closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek, not for him, but for the years wasted on a man she no longer recognized. The judge pronounced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. His head dropped into his hands as the gavel struck. There would be no second chance, no redemption. The man who thought he could control his double life, who thought he could cheat, lie, and hide, would now spend the rest of his years behind bars. As deputies led him away, cameras captured his hollow stare, broadcast to millions. For the public, it was the final chapter of a story that had spiraled from lust to humiliation to blood. For the victim's family, it was justice. And for him, it was the moment he finally understood the cost of a secret he thought no one would ever know. The verdict reverberated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For the victim's family, it was a measure of justice, though justice could never bring her back. They buried her beneath a sky streaked with gray, friends and relatives gathering to whisper prayers and shed tears. Her mother clutched a framed photo, rocking back and forth as if holding onto her daughter's memory could somehow fill the cavern of loss. The community, too, grieved. What had once been whispers about an affair now transformed into conversations about violence, betrayal, and the high cost of secrecy. For his wife, the trial's end was both closure and a final break. She filed for divorce the very next week, her attorney handling the paperwork swiftly. She told reporters she felt nothing for him anymore. No anger, no sorrow, just emptiness. "The man I married," she said quietly, "died a long time ago." She focused on her children instead, doing everything she could to shield them from the spotlight. But classmates can be cruel, and the family bore the sting of shame and ridicule for years to come. Inside prison walls, he was no longer the man who strutted through life, believing he could keep secrets without consequence. Inmates knew his story before he even set foot in the yard. Some mocked him openly, others whispered behind his back. To them, he was the man who lost everything, his pride, his family, his freedom, and then threw away what little remained in a fit of rage. He became a cautionary tale even among criminals, a symbol of how far a man could fall when shame curdled into violence. Outside, the case lived on in headlines, podcasts, and late-night talk shows. True crime commentators dissected every detail, from the hospital's grim surgery to the staged crime scene. Hashtags trended. Hashtag affair gone wrong. Hashtag shame and murder. Hashtag no excuse for violence. Some viewers pitted him, seeing a broken man who spiraled out of control. But most saw him for what the jury declared him to be, a killer who refused to own his choices until it was too late. The affair that began as a search for excitement ended in tragedy that consumed 2 families, shattered children, and scarred a community. A woman lost her life. Her family lost their daughter. A man lost his body, his marriage, his freedom, and finally his soul. The ripple effect stretched far beyond either of them, leaving wounds that would not easily heal. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all. Affairs are rarely just affairs. Lies rarely stay hidden. What begins in shadows has a way of demanding light. And sometimes that light burns everything it touches. He thought it was just a fling, just a secret, just a thrill. But by the time the gavel struck, by the time the prison doors closed behind him, the truth was clear. What he thought was a game had cost him his manhood, his freedom, and another human life. The story ended where it always seemed destined to end. Not with passion, not with redemption, but with silence. Silence in the victim's grave. Silence in the cold cell that became his home. And silence in the hearts of those left behind who would never again believe that a secret could stay buried forever.